I'm going to ask anywhere from 2 to 5 questions, depending on the time, and then we'll open it up to questions for the audience. So the first question I'm going to ask involves, we're Asian Americans, the term model minority, which is a term which is frequently associated with Asian Americans. It's something which came about in the 60s, and it's important to understand that in the time before this term emerged, Asian Americans were not looked at as the model minority. Obviously, for instance, during the term yellow peril has been around for more than a century. Both my parents' families were interned during World War II by the US government. So that term model minority came about in a way as a reaction, as an ideological move against the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. So that's one thing we should think about. So the question is, what do you think are the neglected and problematic aspects of the model minority myth that we need to be aware of and deconstruct? Whoever wants to start, we can start. Yeah.
Can we just throw out?
Yeah.
When I hear the model minority thing, I always think about women in my backyard who were, especially from the working class South Asian women who were who were the guinea pigs for birth control pills. They were forced, many people died, I remember. They were never listed in the media.
I think about model minority. I think about demanding the model minority mutiny. I've been reading a lot around and having conversations around understanding what this term means, as well as where do we fit into like racial justice and racial equity work. And I think a lot around how when I've been in spaces around social justice and racial justice, that reflecting that Asian American experiences or Hmong American experiences have been missing to solve these like inequities, right? And I think that how can we start having these conversations and I think, and I've had these 2 conversations in particular around model minority mutiny, and in those spaces we all have talked about like whiteness, black, racism, but we don't turn around and really center around what does it mean as from the Asian American experience, and how the progressive white social justice movement have centered or built a discourse around us to not see as part of this social justice work, and that some of the common themes that from those conversations are like Black and brown people and Asian people can't work together. We only people end up talking about, East Asians are more richer, so they have to check their privilege. And like, it never comes to center around us. And I've just been thinking a lot around like racial justice and social justice and how this work has excluded us, and how does that support and benefit like the model minority.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So just really briefly, we know that the model minority is a myth, right? I think what's really discouraging to me is I see a lot of allies and also actually Asian American activists who actually think the model minority is true. And that's really discouraging to me. So let's really briefly, let's break down what the model minority is, right? These statistics have been manipulated to present us as a wedge against other people of color, primarily Black, to say, if Asians can make it, why can't you? Okay, so really briefly, but we know if we study model minority that those facts are manipulated, right? We know that Asians are concentrated in the most expensive places to live. We know that the term Asian American represents 48 different ethnicities, all with vastly different socioeconomic realities and experiences. We know that Asian Americans tend to have more wage earning adults in each household, so you can't just look at household income right, to say that they're equal. And we also see that actually Asian Americans have to have higher education than white people to make it equal amount, right? So we know those statistics are manipulated. And I would push us further, I think, to ask us to consider if those statistics can be manipulated there in terms of income and class, where else can they be manipulated? Where else can it kind of obfuscate the Asian American experience? And here's one example. I want to be very careful about how I say this. Right now, the police brutality epidemic is anti-Black. Okay, it is. And as Asian Americans, we need to recognize that. What I find problematic is I read a lot of things by Asian American scholars and activists saying, well, Asians don't suffer from state-sanctioned violence or police brutality, which I think is intensely problematic. Because one, how then do you explain Chun Borizong, Fong Li, and many other Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who do suffer from police brutality? And can we take into account that maybe some of these numbers are obscured because people might be undocumented or mistrust authority and not report it? And the last thing I'll say is actually something that the scholar and activist Juliana Hupegues pointed out. We all know Juliana, right? Yeah, wonderful. One thing that she asked us to consider is really brilliant is because we are Asian and Asian American people, we don't have the same experience as Black people, Native American people, Latino people, right? We don't. But what we do experience is we're always the enemy, right? We're always the enemy to people. We're the other, we're the enemy other. And so what if we started looking at vigilante violence against Asian and Asian American communities, particularly South Asian and Arabs post 9/11, right? If we see the high number of vigilante violence against Asian and Asian American communities, the fact that this vigilante violence is happening to us, that police forces fail to protect us, that judicial systems fail to persecute those who enacted on us, and that they also refuse to see it as racism, that is a different form of state-sanctioned violence against our bodies. And I think that the reason that I bring it up now is that I think model minorities should also teach us that we can't trust straight statistics all the time, and it should encourage us to ask us to think that maybe the common rubrics we use to look at race and racism may render the experiences and suffering of Asian and Asian American people as invisible or illegible.
You know, there's something about being counted and not being counted. So when we talk about Asian Americans, I do think, we can count the people. There's a census count and a percentage of people. But the clothes we wear, I think we need to pull the frame out farther because there are shadow bodies sitting amongst us, right? Think of the Bangladesh garment industry. Half of the clothes we wear are made there. There's just so much that is touching our intimate selves that is made by these shadow bodies who don't fall in our count. But they are, and they may not be Asian Americans, but they are they've got to be part of our consciousness in some way, and their stories.
Couple things about this. One is that the term model minority is really designed to silence the argument that race affects people of color in this society. Because the idea is, because there's a certain segment of the Asian American population which has succeeded economically, and because Asian Americans are not, any sort of activist work is not publicized or known, this idea that we don't make waves, we're quiet. And so, and we don't ally ourselves with other people of color, and if everybody else just did that and approached things as if race did not matter, everything would be fine. Now we know that's not true, but I think the thing about this is we in various different ways we learn this. So could you talk about the ways we learn this, and also the ways in which you find the term Asian American both useful and unwieldy? Because Ananya, you're talking about you don't want to set that boundary between America and what goes on in India, and the global connections economically and politically that happen. And so part of this is how do we make our thinking about all these things more sophisticated, more, and to address the complexities that we're facing.
For sure, I think having conversations, hosting space, looking at like violence that happened in our own community as Asian Americans, and the piece that Bo wrote around assimilation and not having other protection, right? As Asian Americans, and that often the conversations that I hear around the police brutality on Asian Americans, specifically like a lot of like Hmong, like hunters, right, who've been assaulted by like other hunters or property owners or police, also not diving in deeper to see like what is the problems, and a lot of that has to do with like institutional racism, systemic racism, and so I feel like how do we have these conversations in itself, because it's really complex, because Hmong people particularly, because I have been having a lot of conversations around the Salu Vang case that just happened, and there's like the complexities around how Hmong folks will come out when it affects Hmong community, and like do they show up around like other Asian American communities, or like police brutality on Black folks, right? And what does it mean to like show up for like Hmong only, and how does that play a role in shaping our community, and just hearing that some of those people saying race don't matter, but then show up to the space because of Hmongness or ethnic, right? Like to know like why that happens, or why people make sense of race the way that they do. I feel that as Asian Americans or Hmong community, I feel we need to have more conversations around violence and race as a construct. And I think that I've learned a lot about this in like very like white academic or grassroots, social justice place. But when I go home, or when I go and talk to like my brothers and sisters, like they're so really disconnected. And I think how can we start to learn it is to unlearn or deconstruct how we learn around race through a Black and white lens, and how does race as a construct, even though it's it's a construct, it's really real. So I feel like starting to create those spaces and having those conversations, and yeah.
I'm going to go back to one reminder. Before I think in the 1920s, when South Asians were working in Long Island construction, some of the men were allowed to bring their wives. They were also they were also the guinea pigs for the early birth control stuff. The deaths were never reported. So I just want to put that out there. Like they didn't even count. We only know this primarily through oral history stuff. So I think our histories are connected in more ways than one, and not just because of place. People from global communities of color from the South had histories of migration. We had connections with each other also. I want us to remember that history, so it's not just empire that throws us together. And I want to claim that history of connection and connectivity among us I want to celebrate that. So there's that. And then I'm terrified of nationalism and essentialisms. I just think that there's just this division between Asians and Asian Americans. It terrifies me.
Can you just, for people,
define
what you mean by nationalism and essentialism?
Yeah, so by, I was born in India, and I had an Indian passport for a really long time, till it got impossible to do the kind of traveling I was with the, and not get, and to just be humiliated over and over again because of that passport. So I changed my passport to an American passport, but I don't kind of belong to any of those, but, under any of those nation states. So nationalism would have me claim my practice as Indian in certain ways. And it's complicated because I do Indian contemporary dance. The trouble of breaking things down is that it falls into the black hole of whiteness, where everything, disappears. And we all become contained in this grand, this grand sort of, the grand container of whiteness, which can hold all difference. So, and this essentialism of what Asians and Asian Americans versus what we're, technically I'm what people, I guess, what I would be called an FOB, a fresh off the boat, still. So, and there are so many times that I've been told that I'm not a real person of color because I wasn't born here. So, I just think it's just incredibly false. It's like we don't understand histories of colony and empire and slavery and how the economies of those have circuited us together in particular ways. So I just find it really, really scary when we start to not agree to sit in complexity. Our connections are complex. Sometimes they are bad and sometimes they are difficult, and we have to sit with those complexities.